Not My First Language, a memoir. Written and read by Reena Arora-Sánchez. Three. "Let's go, ladies! Time for the big loop!" my trainer shouted. His voice reverberated along the concrete walls of his warehouse-turned-gym while he motioned for my classmates and me to go outside and complete the roughly quarter-mile circle around the complex. I caught my balance before dropping a 30-pound kettlebell and begrudgingly obeyed. "I hate this part," I grunted under my breath. It wasn't that I had a problem with exercise. I had a very specific issue with running. Growing up, I dreaded the mile in gym class. I was always the last one to make it around the 4 laps at the school track, and I could never go the distance without stopping at least twice to catch my breath. I envied kids who effortlessly coasted across the finish line within 6 to 8 minutes without breaking a sweat. It took me nearly 3 times as long, and I would be uncomfortably perspiring by the time it was over. But that's not to say I wasn't athletic. No. For as long as I can remember, I have loved team sports. I've excelled at team sports. First as a starter on my volleyball and basketball teams, then as captain of my discus squad in track and field throughout middle and high school. There's something about hurling an object across a field that really spoke to me. But for some reason, I never got that so-called runner's high everyone loves to tell me about. I tried training with all those 5K apps, took every piece of advice from my half-marathon loving sister, even signed up for charity races. Yet I never understood the joy or satisfaction in the repetitive motion of simply moving in a straight line. I'm sure my lifelong struggle of being overweight was partly to blame. As a large infant who grew into a chubby kid, the baby fat that's expected to melt with time followed me into adulthood. And it wasn't until I went on an extreme diet ahead of my sister's wedding in 2009 that I noticeably lost weight. 50 pounds to be exact. All the accolades and positive reinforcement didn't stop me from feeling confused in my new body. At the end of the day, I couldn't maintain the loss because as soon as I went back to eating real food away from the program's weekly delivery service, all of it came back, and more. That's the thing. They sell you on the idea of being thinner, but nobody bothers to help you figure out what to do once you get there. I was at my heaviest when my mother died, and I knew I had to do something about it in a sustainable way. I was tired of being that round little kid stuck in a failing cycle of yo-yo diets. Yes, I wanted to look good. But more than that, I was acutely aware of my mother's health after slowly watching my mom's body betray her. "Oh, you're like a brick," my maternal grandmother once moaned in her Brooklyn accent after I playfully jumped into her lap when I was 6. Even at that age, I realized I was heavier than the average child, so I was utterly mortified when she felt the need to call it out, and loudly for all to hear. I ran up the stairs of her attached home in shame, hoping the humiliation wouldn't follow. "You know," she reflected years later when butt implants became the cosmetic enhancement du jour, "we always wondered, how did Reenie naturally get such a big behind?" By we, she meant my mother's historically slim side of the family, mostly first and second generation Americans of European descent who sometimes found themselves having to choose between food and shelter. My maternal grandfather grew up so poor that his family would shuffle from one Bushwick apartment to another when they couldn't afford to pay the landlord. On more than one occasion, Grandpa Heaney would naively head to elementary school in the morning alone and return just as alone in the afternoon. No furniture, no family, no home awaited his arrival. He would panic, wander through the neighborhood a bit, then breathe a sigh of relief when an aunt or a cousin popped her head out a window. "Come upstairs," they'd shout. "We live here now." My grandmother's parents from Eastern Europe and Germany, respectively, met on a New York City block their families shared in the 1920s. And that was about the only thing they had in common. They could hardly communicate with one another since English was a second language for both, and their first was a mystery to each. My great-grandmother died under mysterious circumstances, something about going to a hospital notorious for its mental health services and never coming home. before Grandma Heaney hit puberty. My great-grandfather promptly remarried because he couldn't possibly have cared for 2 young daughters without a woman. Both children would be put to work helping clean and maintain the building for which my great-grandfather was the super. My mother's parents managed to secure a newfound level of modest stability by the time she arrived in 1957. One daughter preceded her, and another would follow. By the 1960s, my grandfather, who joined the Navy at 16 so he'd be guaranteed 3 meals a day, had a reputable blue-collar position with a pharmaceutical giant that paid well enough and offered benefits like insurance and stock options. Grandma was able to stay home and manage the family, and like many women of her generation, she never forgot what it was like to scrape by during the Great Depression. Every penny in her adult home was accounted for, including when it came to buying food. Mom was the one who really made it. She manifested her adult life and, effectively, me. I'm going to marry a doctor. I'm going to live on a farm. I'm going to have kids with black eyes, was her mantra growing up. She would repeat it to the universe incessantly, on the city bus going to St. Matthias Catholic Academy, during afternoons with friends on the block outside her apartment. All her life, Mom knew what she wanted, more. And she spoke more into existence. She respected her parents and how they'd risen from their chaotic Depression-era upbringings to provide her and her sisters with a better shot at a more successful future. But there were limited upward mobility options for women of her generation, and in her small world, marriage to a male partner with dreams and a work ethic as strong as hers was the best way out. Always marry up. That was one of her other mantras. My aunt divorced the first of several men by the time she was 21 because she'd chosen the, quote, wrong type of husband, according to my mother. Mom was determined to learn from the mistakes of her older sister. She believed she'd discovered the ideal catalyst to fulfilling her destiny. She had to find a doctor. Doctors were educated. Doctors were motivated. Doctors were rich. I asked her about her choices one day in 2014 as we sat on my brand new gray couch with striped and solid purple pillows. I was feeling sorry for myself after a nasty breakup, and as I processed that I was about to enter my 31st year of life, I couldn't help but compare myself to where Mom had been at my age. Married, 4 kids, dream house. She clutched one of my pillows and relaxed against the oversized cushions, looking wildly anxious yet completely calm while staring blankly out my patio door. The 80s were good, she recalled, not directly addressing the topic at hand. I married Dad. We built the house in Millersburg. I had you kids. She paused. Yeah, it was a good decade. I knew what happened in the 80s. I was there for most of it. Instead, I wish I'd asked her more about the decades prior, the ones where her life would have most mirrored where I presently found myself. That young American woman in the 1970s was an enigma to me. I knew that she enjoyed writing, and she was good at it, but instead went to nursing school. I knew she loved babies and wanted to work wherever they were. I knew she was stuck in a New York City hospital during the historic blackout in the summer of 1977, which spared only a few areas across the 5 boroughs fortunate enough to lie off the main power grid. I knew she had a boyfriend who believed they were more serious than she did, an actor who didn't get paid to act very often. I knew my grandmother called that man hysterically after my mom finally got in touch with her the night the lights went out. "Where is she, Mrs. Heaney?" I imagined the boyfriend shrieked. "I'll go get her right now." My grandmother could barely maintain her grip on the receiver of her yellow corded wall phone as she explained where my mom was. I heard once it could have been a dilapidated psychiatric ward, though I don't recall her ever working in the mental health field. Even though my mother had started evading her beau because sharing a life with a mostly out-of-work actor wasn't part of the plan, he didn't seem to care. He barely said goodbye to my grandmother before rushing off to wherever Mom was at the time so he could safely bring her home. Now, this is where the climax of any cliché, heteronormative romantic comedy would be. The doubtful damsel transformed upon the selfless actions of a man she clearly underestimated. The audience would see this flawed yet protective hero frantically navigating an unprecedented blackout in one of the biggest cities in the world during a notoriously crime-ridden period of its history. All for love. Fast-paced music would set the desperate tempo of a dramatic montage of him jumping into his car, relying solely on his faith to clear dead traffic signals with nothing but headlights illuminating the path. We'd see his white knuckles gripping the worn leather wheel, drops of sweat cascading from his brow. His only thought? Saving this woman's life, even if it meant risking his own. We'd be so invested in him, cheering for him, as he pulled up to a normally busy hospital cloaked in solitude, disregarding parking protocol before rushing into the building to find her. "Michelle!" he'd scream as he sprinted down the hall adjacent to the entrance. Somehow, he was alone. No patients or staff in the vicinity except her. It wouldn't matter that he couldn't see. The lack of one sense only heightened the rest. "Michelle, where are you?" he'd call out again. "If you can hear me, answer me." Cut to my mom cradling herself in a corner somewhere inside, shaking and thinking she'd been mistaken. There was no way that was him. The whole city was on lockdown. We use context clues to assume her mother told her that. How could he have gotten here? Despite her plans to break up with him, she'd be thanking God that he'd come to rescue her, and her voice would crack as she found the strength to finally respond in kind. "I'm here," she'd screech. After a bit of cinematic tension, maybe him going into a handful of wrong rooms, maybe a door that wouldn't open, maybe her leg bleeding from knocking it against a desk as she sought a safe place to hide, he would find her, and they would embrace. She would melt into the familiarity of his arms, forgetting that she didn't even like him, let alone love him. He'd forget how anxious he'd been and say something light and mildly misogynistic to mark the end of the drama. "Don't you scare me like that again, young lady," for example. She'd cry, smile, and breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. By the end of the movie, my mother would realize this guy was worth his weight in gold, regardless of how much he might not earn in his lifetime. He was there for her during her most vulnerable moment. He had proven his loyalty, and they'd recount their story of true love over and over as they lived out the next phase of their lives, maybe somewhere on Long Island. But this wasn't a rom-com, and Long Island wasn't part of the plan. He wasn't part of the plan. Even though he did, in fact, pick her up from some hospital in New York City that dark July night, it didn't stop her from ghosting him 1970s style. Like many young women in her community, Mom lived with her parents until she married my father in January 1980. It would neither have been practical, why waste money on rent, nor proper, an unmarried woman living alone, for a traditional Catholic girl like her to assert independence. She had to wait until the right man came along with the expectation that she would move from her parents' house directly into a shared home with a man she hardly knew. All part of the plan. My white working-class maternal grandparents were not overtly racist. They never intentionally spoke badly of people of color around their mixed grandchildren. Occasionally, we'd pass a South Asian family while out on a drive, and my grandmother would shout, "Hey, look, it's your cousins." She thought it was funny. My grandparents were simply happy to have survived the 1930s and 40s. They didn't make it past high school, never saw a need or desire to explore the world beyond their neighborhood. They didn't even go to India for my parents' second wedding ceremony with my father's family and friends. Rather, they sent my maternal grandfather's cousin to represent the Heeneys. Actually, I'm lying. My grandfather did see the world on that Navy ship that took him through the Panama Canal, as well as to that conflict on the Korean Peninsula where he almost lost his life. Almost. If it hadn't been for a fellow serviceman who saw my grandfather lying face down on a beach and didn't dismiss him as a casualty of war. In adulthood, my parents called a long, segregated neighborhood in Queens home, one that, like so many in New York City, eventually became a trendy, overpriced haven for young people craving individuality. For most of my grandparents' lives, diversity meant the first-generation kid who spoke Polish, or the Italian pizza shop owner who shut down the business every winter to visit the motherland. White diversity is what they meant. So when my brown father showed up on their doorstep to pick up my white mother for the first time, my grandparents were confused. "Shell, this is your date?" my grandfather asked in the accent shaped on Knickerbocker Avenue as he peered suspiciously through the thin lace curtains that were more for decoration than privacy. His short-sleeved button-down shirt exposed the farmer's tan covered in tattoos from his nautical days, one with my grandmother's name. Small strands of gray peeked through his once thick black hair, which my grandmother regularly compared to a Brillo pad. Mom didn't understand the problem. "He's a doctor, Pops," she explained. "Exactly, he's one of them." In this case, them didn't mean person of color. It didn't insinuate other. Grandpa meant that my dad was a dead ringer for one of those immigrant doctors about whom my mother complained relentlessly. "I mean, these physicians from Sri Lanka or Pakistan or wherever, they're all married," she'd lament in disgust in her parents' tiny kitchen in the back of the house while my grandmother cooked dinner. "They have wives back home. They come here for the residency and start messing around with all the white nurses. Oh, it's horrible." She didn't get it. Marriage was a sacred commitment. At least, that's what she'd had drilled into her brain at Catholic school. How could anyone cheat on the person they'd promised God they would honor forever? And while halfway around the world from loved ones? The deception was enough to turn my mother's stomach. After months of hearing anecdotes like this, my grandparents simply assumed my mother would stay away from any brown doctor in that hospital. She couldn't be sure who had a secret family back in Delhi or Lahore. But here she was, inviting one of them to her parents' home, to take her on a date, to maybe get serious. Because ultimately, she had a plan. Doctor? Check. Black eyes? Check. Now what about that farm? My older sister arrived 11 months after my parents' Catholic wedding ceremony, born at the same Brooklyn hospital where my grandmother and mother came into the world. I would follow there in 1983. The farm Mom always wanted would come 3 years later. My father's upbringing was far from the relatively comfortable middle-class experience of my mother. Sure, he would become a doctor, eventually. He made a boatload of money, eventually. He paid 4 university tuitions, eventually. But his family went from riches to rags before he was even born. How? Partition. To most, it's just a word, a way to describe a barrier, perhaps a light interior wall dividing a shared space, a fixture in most office cubicles. But what happened in 1947 was undoubtedly one of the bloodiest events in our shared human history, one that the eldest South Asians among us can still recall with clarity. The British left the Indian subcontinent after years and years of well-documented divide-and-conquer colonization. South Asians across the region had long fought for independence, but the British Raj finally ended after World War II. What followed was a violent, chaotic transition, one that those who have studied it say is among the largest instances of forced mass migration in history. Partition divided the land into Hindu and Sikh, majority India, and Muslim majority Pakistan, later India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, respectively. Among the millions of displaced refugees were my Hindu paternal grandparents and my 4 young uncles. Family lore insists that my paternal grandfather, the eldest of his siblings, dreamed of becoming a doctor while growing up. But the universe had other plans. His father died when my grandfather was barely an adult, leaving the family business in my grandfather's hands. Grandpa Aurora was doing well for himself until an historic earthquake devastated the city of Quetta in the 1930s, trapping him, his wife, and their son under the rubble of their recently built home. By the grace of destiny, my grandfather made it out alive, yet undeniably traumatized, a trauma he never had the opportunity to resolve. Life moved far too quickly for that. He was expected to remarry once he dusted himself off, was eventually set up with my grandmother, and did his best to move forward. After all, there were too many people depending on him to be strong. My grandparents' existence was stable and relatively drama-free for a while, as drama-free as one can be living under colonial rule during an independence movement, anyway. Then, partition happened. Blood, hardship, xenophobia. The peak of generational distress that would shape children of the South Asian diaspora for years and years to come. My grandparents genuinely didn't think they'd survive one of the so-called trains of death to Delhi when they were forced out of their home in 1947, the second house my grandfather had lost. Trains carrying refugees from one newly established country to another were often targets of mob violence, sometimes set ablaze before they arrived at their intended destination. The consensus among reputable sources is that nearly 1 million people died and upwards of 12 million were displaced along the journey, whether they were Sikhs or Hindus fleeing to India or Muslims desperate to arrive in newly formed Pakistan. Like many families during that period, all mine had was their faith, the clothes on their backs, and each other. After safely uniting with loved ones in Delhi, my grandparents had no choice but to carry on. After all, they had 4 other mouths to feed, 4 little ones who would someday have to process their own trauma. One more would follow over the next couple of years: my dad. My grandparents rented a small house with my grandfather's brother and his children in the Indian capital, and 8 cousins would grow up in just 2 rooms. By day, those rooms would serve as living areas for meals, for homework, for prayers, and for visitors. At night, they would be converted into sleeping quarters for all 12 inhabitants. My grandfather's family kept that house for the longest time, and when we visited during one of my childhood trips to India, my dad dramatically pointed to a corner with a television and proclaimed his mother had given birth to him on that very patch of dirt in May of 1950. "No wonder you love TV so much," I joked in my own sheltered way, as though it were completely normal for someone to be born on a dirt floor in an impoverished country right after a major political event that was responsible for the deaths of thousands upon thousands of innocent people. My parents were both conventionally thin when they met and got married, mostly because they were both raised with limited food on the table, but also because they were very active. My dad was a runner, believe it or not. When they built their home in Amish country in 1986 with that quarter-mile-long paved driveway that looped around the front of our house, I'd often see my dad jogging up, down, and around for hours, maintaining that momentum until his knees gave out. Back at boot camp with my trainer, I pushed myself to complete the big loop just ahead of the other girls, determined never to come in last again. "You don't have to be the fastest in the group," I once learned from a nutritionist. "You just gotta outrun the bear." One of my coworkers had recommended this boot camp a few weeks before I found out my mother wasn't going to make it. I was off to a good start and going to classes 3 times a week, but had to leave the program to be with my family. The trainer who led the exercises assured me I'd be welcomed back whenever I was ready to start again, which I did after that humiliating conversation with Van. "Nice job, everyone," Coach K cheered as his exhausted students reconvened to cool down and stretch. "How do you feel?" I was sure that I could have sold my menacing glare much more convincingly if I weren't out of breath. But despite how far this new physical routine was out of my comfort zone, I knew I owed it to myself and my mother to build healthier habits. If Mom were alive, she'd be watching what she ate and walking her usual 5 miles a day on the treadmill in her bedroom, the one with the picture of Sir Paul McCartney rocking out in front of the Union Jack taped to the digital display. She found it in a magazine years ago and felt inspired by her longtime idol, so there it stayed to motivate her. "Seriously, how are you feeling?" Coach K asked me privately after I emerged from child's pose and shook out my limbs. I bobbed my head indecisively. "Well, it's still really hard," I laughed nervously. "It's been quite a road." I could tell he knew I wasn't just talking about the workouts. My body wasn't in line with my brain that first day I'd returned to his boot camp, and I felt like such a failure when I ran outside crying halfway through class. A few weeks had passed since that day, and I was slightly more confident in my abilities when Coach K inquired about my mental state. He smiled and gently put his right hand on my left shoulder, having to raise his bodybuilder arm just a bit higher to make contact with me. "You'll get there. I can already see an improvement," he assured me. And remember, these things take time. I knew he meant the physical and the emotional. I smiled and nodded politely, trying to forget the fact that my legs felt stuck in wet cement. I managed to hobble over to the cubby area to retrieve my towel and cell phone. I sat for a moment, breathing and scrolling through the notifications I'd missed in just 1 hour. An unread message from that man in Pereira, Colombia appeared, and suddenly, I had all the energy in the world. Before social media developed into the crowded, contentious behemoth we know and love to hate today, I had my sights set on being an influencer, at least whatever that meant in the year 2014. I was an up-and-coming marketing professional who pioneered a university's social media program before anyone truly understood its business value. The good old days. Enough people knew me from my work around the Charlotte area that I imagined I could parlay my local popularity into a larger following. So I boldly removed my Instagram privacy settings and invited the world to experience my very interesting life, mostly musings from my highly entertaining 3-year-old niece. Who wouldn't want a front row seat to that? It was during that window when a stranger from Colombia's Eje Cafetero started following me. I didn't think too much of it and instinctively gave him a follow back, which was basic etiquette for someone looking to grow their online presence at the time. I eventually learned that we had a mutual friend in JC, someone I'd met on my second visit to Colombia in 2012, and with whom I'd stayed in touch over the years. There was never anything romantic between JC and me. We were more like long-lost siblings who grew up speaking different languages on opposite sides of the world, yet inherently understood each other from day one. JC was not at all fluent in English and had no interest in learning since he claimed he was never planning to leave South America. Fortunately, I'd been studying Spanish since 6th grade and had enough of a grasp on the language, albeit clumsy, to have conversations with him. So imagine my surprise when JC married his high school sweetheart a couple of years later and followed her to Paris, France. JC had never set foot outside Colombia before then and didn't know anyone in Europe besides his in-laws. And although I poked a little fun at him for eating his words, I was proud of him for taking such a big risk and diving into the immigrant experience, a reality with which I was intimately familiar. JC picked up French and English in no time after finding a job at a small convenience store in his new neighborhood outside of Paris. He had no choice, really. He just committed to living and working in the epicenter of Europe, a gateway to a world he never imagined he'd know in his lifetime. And because he finally saw the value of being fluent in English, he began practicing with me. "Hi," he declared one day over video chat. "How are you?" "JC," I gasped. "What? How?" I couldn't believe it. Was this my friend? I almost wanted to say, "I told you so," but I was so proud of him for taking such a big step that I swallowed my words and instead praised him for his courage and his willingness to learn something new. He laughed. "I guess I speak English now, eh?" We talked every day for years after that. Fast forward to the following Christmas when JC made the pilgrimage home to Pereira for the holidays and met up with neighborhood friends he'd been sorely missing over the past several months, including that man. The guys in La Villa were eager to hear stories from his escapades in Europe, a place most of them had only seen in the movies. They also wanted to know how he'd learned English so quickly. I guess that was more intriguing than how he'd learned French, given their proximity to the United States. And that's when my name came up. JC told them he spoke to his friend in the US daily over Facebook Messenger, rarely in Spanish anymore, and that I'd been a major part of his learning process. That man was aware of my platonic relationship with JC through Instagram, but he didn't realize just how close JC and I were. Unlike his now Parisian friend, that man had spent a lifetime learning to be bilingual, first at a local English immersion school, then by challenging himself to listen to music and watch movies exclusively in English outside the classroom. He'd only met one other native English speaker in Colombia, a student in an exchange program from Wisconsin, and was intrigued by the idea of practicing regularly with someone from the United States. That man wanted in. He asked JC if he should reach out to me and formally introduce himself. "Como quiera," JC reportedly replied with a shrug. The day after Christmas 2014, that man mustered the courage to send me a Facebook friend request, far more intimate than an Instagram follow at the time. I was attempting to enjoy the holiday season in the house where my mother would die 7 days later, reviewing the notification and wondering if this was just another person from my travels eager to be a voyeur into my life. Who was that? I asked myself when I saw his name. Did I meet him in Pereira on that trip 2 years ago? I couldn't be sure. He didn't look familiar at all. I realized JC was a mutual friend of ours and sent him a message. "Hey bro," I captioned a screenshot of the friend request. "You know this dude?" As usual, JC immediately replied. "Yeah, he's one of my friends. I think he wants to speak more English. Don't worry, he's harmless." That was code for, "He's not looking to take advantage of you or ask you for money." Sounded innocent enough to me. I ambivalently accepted the request without piecing together that this was the same man from Instagram, the one with a photo of Chinese food on which I'd robotically commented, "Looks good." Remember, I was trying to be an influencer, so I had to engage with my followers. But I never dreamed that man and I would have an actual conversation. That all changed on New Year's Day 2015, when Dad insisted I take some time to recharge after helping him care for my mother nonstop since November. A few friends invited me to ring in the new year at a resort in North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and I gladly spent December 31st mindlessly eating, drinking, dancing, and relaxing with them as much as I could. After the clock struck midnight, a seemingly insignificant event happened that would change the trajectory of my life. A message from a friend of a friend that would lead me on an international journey of love, joy, and pain. "Happy New Year," that man wrote at 3 a.m. from Palmira, Colombia, where he was spending the holiday at his grandmother's house. "Happy New Year," I replied, not thinking much of it at the time. It was one of many New Year's salutations coming in from all over the world, and I was simply being polite to JC's close friend. Besides, I was still technically talking to Van, though he made it clear we weren't exclusive based on that conversation we'd had around Christmas. The chat bubbles continued. That man was writing back, and back, and back. We exchanged amicable messages for about 2 hours, and even though his grasp on the language was perfectly fine to me, that man was scared to speak exclusively in English for fear of messing up. We transitioned to Spanish so I could mess up instead. My friends caught me lingering over my phone and immediately demanded details, but there wasn't much to say. All I could tell them was that this was just some guy in JC's circle who randomly reached out to me. Having witnessed my tumultuous dating history firsthand, they exchanged hopeful glances, wondering, could this be the start of something special? This chapter reflects my personal recollections and is not intended to serve as a factual record. Memory is imperfect, and others might recall events differently. Certain names, details, and dialogue have been altered or reconstructed for clarity and privacy.